Good afternoon. Welcome back. This is Geography 130, lecture number 12. But before we can actually get into lecture number 12, we have to finish lecture number 11 as far as the slides are concerned. Are there any housekeeping things we have to attend to, are there? Okay. So last time we were discussing natural capital and looking in particular at the work of Robert Costanza. I didn't quite make it through all the slides. I'm going to pick up with this one here. I just pointed out the apparent contradiction in the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, which I've mentioned before, in which on the one side they attribute a great deal of the world's environmental problems to the effects of markets on ecosystem services, natural processes, that sort of thing. And yet on the other side they prescribe, or they seem to prescribe, expanding the realm of the market to include externalities, to include the bad things produced in the course of a lot of natural resource use, and give them prices so that actors in the market have to account for those negative costs, and to create markets where none exist at all, such as is being proposed for carbon dioxide under cap and trade, that kind of thing. So I've depicted this graphically up here as these two circles, the inside one, the private commodified one, growing to cover more and more and more of what otherwise might be considered outside the market, ecological processes that don't have prices. And that this paradigm we might call the green governance paradigm. That term, I'm not certain is quite the best one, but referring to the idea that you can actually sort of blend the economy and ecology or ecosystems and use the market as a tool for achieving the governance of natural resources. Hence the idea that this is green governance. And this is frequently also advanced with a lot of ideas about non-governmental forms of governance, the role of nonprofit groups, the role of international organizations, institutions, rather than simply nation-state laws regulating use and pollution, that sort of thing. So are there any questions about that? Yeah? Do nonprofits commodify these things? They frequently are proposed as playing important roles in the overall institutional framework for this. In other words, they might serve as third-party verifiers of the performance of certain kinds of things. There are nonprofits and also for-profit firms that have sprouted up to provide certain kinds of certification, for example. Industries might help sponsor the existence of some kind of neutral third-party institution that trains people and collects paperwork and does various kinds of monitoring to ensure that, for instance, the forestry practices of a given company comply with rules for sustainable forestry, that sort of thing. There are a lot of these things going on, whether it's forestry, whether it's various kinds of fair trade production of certain kinds of commodities like bananas and coffee. And these are not governmental agencies, but they're performing roles that we might otherwise imagine government agencies performing, right, of monitoring, licensing, certifying, that sort of thing. Okay, so then I went back and started looking at the evolution of Robert Costanza's thinking about this question of how do you value natural capital? If, as he says, most of the things we think about or worry about for ecosystem services and the performance of natural capital, he says, are public goods. They are outside the market. Bringing them inside the market by pricing them or otherwise somehow commodifying them necessarily means you have to make this translation between those public goods and sort of difficult to quantify things and prices. In 1992, I believe, the first of the articles that I asked you to read, Costanza and Daly, suggested that this process of evaluating the value of natural capital, the valuation of natural capital, should be entirely separate from the market. That other kinds of social processes, and they really mean sort of deliberative political processes, are necessary to assess these things. That the individualistic behavior of people in markets, where they are simply evaluating costs and benefits and making individual decisions about the kinds of things to consume or how much to pay for them, are inappropriate for grappling with the much bigger scale, longer term, nebulous or difficult issues of evaluating natural capital. This would put the process entirely outside of market cost, supply and demand curves, that sort of thing. They went on to say one can generally not value capital directly, natural capital. Discounting behavior may be symptomatic of a kind of semi-rational sub-optimizing behavior known as a social trap. He's referring here to the notion that trying to impose a discount rate on these decisions, and a discount rate typically means that you only look out in time anywhere from 7 years to maybe 25 years at most. And after that, everything beyond that has basically drops to nothing in your quantitative evaluation of what it will be worth 25 years from now, 50 years from now. That kind of thinking, they suggest, is actually semi-rational, and I think they almost mean irrational, when you're thinking about the long-term viability of these natural systems. There's a reasonable case to be made for a zero discount rate in decisions taken on behalf of society at large. I think that's about how far I got last time. So they offer, in this early piece, these criteria for, or definitional attributes of sustainable development. This is what sustainable development would mean circa 1992 for Costanza and Daly. You must maintain total natural capital intact. And if you remember, that means the sum of renewable and non-renewable natural capital. Once carrying capacity has been reached, the simultaneous choice of a population level and an average standard of living, or level of per capita resource consumption, becomes necessary. They boil this down by saying your harvest rates have got to be less than your regeneration rates. You shouldn't take out of a system more than the system can replenish on its own in a given period of time. In other words, you shouldn't deplete aquifers. You should take whatever the sort of sustainable harvest from that aquifer is and make sure you're not exceeding the rate at which it's regenerating, resupplying itself. You should also make sure that your waste emissions are less than the assimilative capacity of the sinks into which you are emitting them, right? So you don't want to put more nutrients and sewage into a river or a lake or the oceans than those systems can assimilate and process in a given period of time. Fairly basic, intuitively clear notion of what sustainable development would require. And I would, coming back to that top one, reiterate that they seem to hold out the possibility of the use of non-renewable natural capital, provided that it is compensated by an increase in renewable natural capital. So, I mean, how you might exactly balance those two things or measure them against each other, nonetheless, there's a possibility under this definition, 1992, that you can use non-renewable resources and be involved in sustainable development at the same time. The two are compatible within limits. Any questions? You should strive to hold throughput, consumption of total natural capital, constant at present levels, or lower, truly sustainable levels, by taxing total natural capital consumption, especially energy, very heavily. Seek to raise most public revenue from such a natural capital depletion, NCD tax, and compensate by reducing the income tax. So you might continue using non-renewable natural capital, but its use should be taxed. And if you deplete total natural capital, the activities that deplete it should also be taxed. And these should be the sources of revenue rather than taxing things like income. Now, there seems to be, well, I've got a couple of objections or questions that I want to put to Costanza and Daly. This one, I believe, is actually addressed pretty directly in the final reading that I asked you to do from 2009, Costanza's essay about development in a full world. Okay, and I'm going to talk about that in a moment. Nonetheless, first question: what if ecosystem breakdowns actually generate economic activity and growth? What if you can make money from the deterioration of natural resources? The problems created by unsustainable development become industries, right? And this is certainly something that we can point to and observe. And in fact, Costanza 2009, his most recent piece, goes on at some length about this and emphasizes that this is actually very much the case. So he says the world has changed dramatically. We now live in a world relatively full of humans and their built capital infrastructure. Material consumption beyond real need can actually reduce our well-being. Natural and social capital are now the limiting factors to sustainable human well-being in many countries. Did I go over this last time? He suggests that previously the limiting factor to our prosperity and economic development was built capital, or capital in the sort of sense that we've been talking about thus far, money to invest in productive capacity. He says that's no longer the case. Now the limiting factor is in fact natural capital, and he throws social capital in there as well. I'm not entirely sure why, but he suggests that these things that used to be sort of abundant, so abundant that we didn't need to worry terribly much about them, are now the things we should be concerned about. And he moreover stresses that somehow the production of more goods, material consumption, in fact may be causing a decline in human well-being overall. And he goes on about this. He says well-being tends to correlate well with health, level of education, and marital status, and not very well with incomes beyond a certain fairly low threshold. And he cites studies for this. I mean, this is not his area of expertise, but he cites other economists or perhaps they're psychologists who have done studies and looked at numbers and decided that these are the things that actually correlate best with overall well-being of a population. And we might think back here also to the curve in one of those Littibacci figures, suggesting that as income goes up, you see significant changes in life expectancy and, for instance, fertility and mortality, but that beyond a certain level, that effect begins to dissipate. In other words, increasing wealth on a per capita basis, at some point you get to the point where there's enough, and you don't continue to see sort of linear increases in these basic measures of prosperity or well-being. However, he says, from the perspective of GDP, gross domestic product, he actually in his article says growth domestic product for some reason, more crime, more sickness, more war, more pollution, more fires, storms, and pestilence are all potentially good things because they can increase marketed activity in the economy. So this is his way of further driving home the idea that our conventional measures of economic prosperity and well-being, frequently GDP per capita or income per capita, may actually be very perverse measures of human well-being. And if we look around our own society and recognize that something like somewhere between a sixth and a seventh of our economy is devoted to healthcare, what you see is an enormous industry built around people being sick. This is the kind of example I think he would point to. More car crashes means more money to replace those cars, right? In other words, all kinds of things that are obviously bad can in fact increase the overall size of the economy and provide profit. The United States and several other developed countries are now in a period of what Herman Daly has called uneconomic growth, where further growth in marketed economic activity is actually reducing well-being on balance rather than enhancing it. When does he say this growth in well-being stopped in the United States? Did anybody notice? He points to the early 1970s, which is also actually about the time when, as we saw in an earlier lecture, real wages stopped going up on average. But in any event, he's essentially condemning the economic systems of the United States and several other developed countries as being not only unsustainable in terms of natural capital, but actually being the opposite of good, the opposite of what they should be, which is means of fostering well-being among people. He wants us to reevaluate the purpose of the market, right? Any questions? Okay. Most natural and social capital assets are public goods. Making them private property does not work well. On the other hand, leaving them as open access resources with no property rights does not work well either. What is needed is a third way to propertize these resources without privatizing them. And here he alludes to the work of people like Elinor Ostrom, who have done a lot with focusing on common property, the idea that you can have public goods that don't belong to any one private party, but which are nonetheless collectively managed and taken care of by some group of people who all share access to it. And such institutions have been poorly recognized and in many ways ignored by economists for most of the last 100 years. And Elinor Ostrom just won a Nobel Prize in economics for having drawn attention to the fact that such systems do in fact exist and can in fact work quite well as ways of stewarding natural resources. So he's sort of signing on to that, pulling that train of recent thinking in economics into his argument as well. Yeah. What about the BLM, the Bureau of Land Management? That's a very good question. It would not count as a third way under his discussion here. He's contrasting sort of two major ways that natural resources have been brought under property regimes up till now, in at least developed contexts. One being public, i.e. owned by the government, and the other being private, owned by private individuals. And, well, it's funny. My sense is that he would probably include the BLM and many other public land management agencies in the U.S. as examples of failed natural resource management rather than successful. I don't think he would say they're open access, because they really aren't open access. I mean, there is an element of control. But the kind of big bureaucratic government ownership is not in very good favor in the eyes of most of this literature. And so when he says a third way of propertizing, I think he's actually trying to refer to more common property type systems, which are, generally speaking, when people talk about common property and its virtues or the things that have been sort of under-recognized about them, they are explicitly not talking about handing a resource to a bureaucracy and having the bureaucracy manage it. They're talking about more participatory frameworks rather than bureaucratic management, generally speaking. So I suspect he would point to the BLM and say, well, no, that's not quite what we're talking about here. But it's a good question. So he then offers us these 6 principles of sustainable governance. You can read them in the article: responsibility, scale matching, precaution, adaptive management, full cost allocation, and participation. And he would like to see more institutions developed or current institutions changed to reflect these principles of sustainable governance. Have you got questions about any of those? He then proposes these policies to achieve real sustainable development. First, he says zero fossil fuel use and a higher quality of life. He suggests that we need to envision, at the very least, as a starting point, how we could have a higher quality of life with zero fossil fuel use. So this is very different from the position outlined in the 1992 paper. Basically, I think because of climate change concerns, non-renewable natural resources such as fossil fuels are now deemed strictly incompatible with sustainable development in Robert Costanza's view. New measures and institutions to replace gross domestic product: the World Bank, the IMF, and the WTO. Everyone know what these are? The IMF, the International Monetary Fund, the WTO, the World Trade Organization. These are modest proposals, aren't they? He wants to see us shift national goals to maximizing GPI, which I think was genuine progress indicator or something like that, or index. And this would be an index of some kind that would actually look at things like health, education, other measures of well-being other than income, right? He wants to reform tax policies to tax negatives and not positives. This is similar to the earlier suggestion, that we should tax things that are bads and not tax things that are goods. Income being something that most people would say people want to have more of, right? So why tax something that people see as good, tax something that is bad, like CO2 emissions or energy use. Expand common property systems and reform international trade. So what this looks like to me, well, first let's suggest that this might be a way, some way. I'm not completely satisfied with this, but working with the series of figures that I've put up here thus far, this seems like a way of trying to characterize what Costanza appears now to be proposing as the paradigm, a new paradigm for a full world, in which the economy, the quantified, marketed, private, commodified part of things, is contained within and does not expand to include everything. Is somehow its borders are managed or regulated, but the borders are now regulated not just by the state or laws in the conventional nation-state regulatory paradigm, but through some mix of state and non-state institutions, such as common property arrangements that might figure out some kind of third way between public and private ownership. And there's all of this being managed adaptively. How many of you are familiar with the concept of adaptive management? Only a few of you. Here Costanza is tapping into another large and growing body of literature, this one in conservation biology and certain branches of ecology, proposing management that is geared towards ongoing learning, in which science and management sort of come together and you sort of cautiously and deliberately make management interventions, but then work very hard to make sure that you monitor what happens and learn from it, so that you don't just build a fence around something and say you can't use this. That is no longer seen as adequate for conservation. Instead, you have to find ways to make that use sustainable, and you do it by managing adaptively, making management and science come together to ensure that decisions are made in light of the best science and in ways that produce the greatest learning. And this is another kind of buzzword right now, along with natural capital, ecosystem services, resilience, and so forth. Adaptive management is a big buzzword in natural resource policy discussions nowadays. And so all of this, in a sense, this looks like a way of making everyone happy. But it's also actually a fairly radical paradigm if he's serious. In other words, if we take him at his word, he is laying out something that is extreme. Now, the problem I see with this, or the question I would pose, first, what if natural capital doesn't actually become capital until it isn't working anymore? And this is a way of posing the question: is natural capital actually a coherent theory? What theory of capital is being used that treats all of these different things simply as variations of the same concept? Social capital, natural capital, human capital, you name it. All of these are supposed to be in common capital. But he's articulating a theory in which he has more or less, by this point anyway, condemned the entire market economy as being perverse, destructive, unsustainable. And it's not clear that we have a sort of underlying theory that actually hangs together other than this condemnation of the current status quo system. Anybody have any thoughts on this? The question I pose here is, generally speaking, you don't see a market develop around something until it's scarce. And if you look at the history of the use of natural resources in various settings, the fisheries of California being a great example, but you can find them elsewhere as well, generally speaking, natural capital gets capitalized on, gets used very aggressively precisely because it's free or very cheap. It's abundant. That creates profit opportunities until some kind of crash occurs and it becomes scarce. And that's the point at which you actually see investments of what we would call capital, built capital, to either shift to another resource, find a substitute, or intensify production in such a way as to sort of replace the broken down natural capital. In other words, you don't, to wish these ecosystem services into the category of capital simply on the claim that, well, they produce human well-being, I think actually elides the critical distinction between those things that are provided by nature, spontaneously, so to speak, and which directly inform and make profitable certain kinds of activity, and what happens after the limits of sustainability of those resources are reached. Yeah?
Well, could you imagine that natural capital becomes, is still capital in the sense that it provides problems, like businesses now are using that capital in the sense of problem solving, so they're making profit off of solving the problem?
Certainly.
Natural capital?
Certainly.
So wouldn't that, in a sense, make it?
At that point, I would say that it's actually capital in the conventional sense, exactly. Right? So the natural capital has been depleted, and you invest to replace it or make good on the situation despite its loss. But to me, at that point, you're no longer talking about natural capital. In other words, there's so